Hello, and welcome to Broadcast Astrology Insight for Humans. You're sitting here with Lisa Pesnichek and me, Sarah Beckner, and we're going to spend a little bit of time going through the Leo new moon lunation chart, which is a predictive chart for the year ahead, for the month ahead. Goodness. The Leo new moon takes place on August 4th at 7:13 a.m. EDT. And we'll be exploring it from both a neoclassical and Uranian astrology lens. So bringing in the trans-Neptunian planets, which I really think add another level of nuance that is really interesting in the context of a year that is very exciting, given that it's an election year. And it's an exciting year because it's a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. This year has really been punctuated by Uranus and that conjunction and the influence of that kind of change and the atmosphere of sort of things aren't exactly predictable right now. It's a little high voltage. So let's go ahead, Lisa, and pull up the lunation chart
All right.
and we'll dive in.
Hey, hello, everybody. So great to be here today. Yeah. So where to start with this chart? I think one of the things that I often begin with when I look at a chart is what planet is the most elevated. And in this chart, it's Uranus. And there tends to be, for many of the timing charts, like the Aries ingress, I believe also the Aries solar eclipse chart, that there's a strong Uranus theme happening, oftentimes exaggerated either by Jupiter or Mars. Here, we just have the same storyline happening, and this Uranus is tying in. It's to this chart, it's square to the ascendant, and it's also by many different means suggesting that the government that's in place is under a state of duress. And we can see that in several different ways. I'm not going to go into the details, but there are many things that I think that both Sarah and I landed on pretty quickly upon looking at this chart, is that there's some significant change happening in the government that stands right now. And I don't know if that it partially has to do with just the fragility of Biden's health or just this rapid rise of Kamala Harris on the Democratic ticket. But there's definitely some more change and turbulence as well as unexpected turns of events that we can expect within our government this month.
Yeah, I think government is the first thing that sort of jumps out of the chart loud and clear. And part of that is because in this chart, we see that the leadership is in a state of crisis. And there are some configurations that really indicate some level of dissolution or loss. And I don't know if this is really speaking to the power of the current administration somewhat receding, at least as it stands with Biden as our president, that he could be losing some level of authority or not able to function in the capacity that he has in terms of showing up in leadership. Yeah, there's something that indicates a major rearrangement on that level. And like you said, some crisis within the system. And then the actual lunation shows up in the 12th house. And so there's something, I felt the pull in this chart between the parts that were really screaming and the quieter parts that really speak to some level of going inward or grappling with our own thinking, feeling, grieving, whatever we're sitting with in an internal way.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of surrender to some degree within the larger picture, especially when we on the chart are looking at the lunation itself. And the surrender on some level involves our deeper beliefs, our strongly held convictions, our view of the world at large, as well as the ways that we're having a hard time in the United States and have for some time figuring out what's the truth. And I think that in some ways we may be really in that place of what is the truth? What is the truth behind our government? And maybe that's some of the things that's coming out of the government is there what looks to be a potential sort of spin out could be bringing light to things that's very troubling on some level.
Yeah, and I don't know historically what these sort of election years look like chart-wise, but there's just such a potent signature in terms of how this year is being informed by our belief system and what don't we believe and or what do we believe? And with Poseidon on the IC, it really highlights the theme of worldview, culture, cognition, all of these things about we're coming to understand the general atmosphere of the collective right now
Mhm.
in a way that is very clear from the chart is not obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, and while we're in the chart, I think that just a couple like, one other thing to point towards that I think is important, it's definitely not one of the things that in this chart in particular stands out, but it is a very important transit that's going to be taking place this month, which is Jupiter square Saturn. It's definitely in orb right now. And what this points towards is really along the same lines of what we've been speaking to for so far in this podcast, which is a drastic change in government that government's undergoing a time of readjustment. And a lot of this goes back to late 2020 when Jupiter and Saturn had their great conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius. And it was actually degrees Aquarius, like 30 something minutes. And you can see here's Pluto reflecting that on that same sensitive point, which is also the same, very close to the position of the precessed Pluto from the United States inception chart. There are several things that point towards the skeletons in the closet for the United States government coming to a head, as well as how do we move forward as we unearth these more mucky, less pleasant parts of our culture. And I think that we'll see some of that as we, for the next couple months, have a Black minority woman vying for presidency against a very white male and who represents the older school version and what's going to be brought up. And I have a sense that this month we're probably going to see a lot of that popping up in ways that it could also send us all to the 12th house. Oh my gosh, I should, like, what have we done? Like a lot of reflection and as well as surrendering to something in that as well.
And potentially a feeling of loss, depending on
Mhm.
where you stand on that side of the spectrum, this Jupiterian impulse to expand, to grow, to move into new places, or the Saturnian structures that want to hold on, that don't want to rock the boat too quickly, that want to
Yeah.
provide stability, that don't want to see the change happen too fast.
Hmm.
And Jupiter, Saturn, in just a universal sense as significators, imply some need for patience.
Hmm.
And if you look at like combination of stellar influences, they talk about this combination as discontent, emotional tension, and have the need to suppress self-destructive thoughts,
Hmm.
which I thought was interesting too, given that we're in this vulnerable place this month. Um, and again, it seems like in some ways a little quieter, but before we flip screens, we have to point out some of this stuff going on by declination. We have that would indicate that there's possibility for something to really shake us up too.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that?
It just occurred to me as I was thinking about it that maybe this would be better expressed on the dials.
Okay, perfect. Let's do that.
I do want to point out before we switch, just with Poseidon on the IC, that I do think there's a caution around actual flooding this month that kind of concerns me with some of the other
Mhm.
chart features.
Definitely. And we'll
It's hard to think about flooding when we're sitting in Colorado with the fires raging right now, but
Yeah, and I think that when we turn to it's not so evident in this chart, but once we switch to 90 degrees, we'll be able to point it out a little bit more directly. But this is the 360 dial pointed focused on the Aries point. And one of the things I've been doing work around looking at the election. And one of the things that really stood out is that Uranus and Volcanus are in this on and off longer term relationship to the Aries point. And what that means is that we're in these strong moments of heightened volatility and uncertainty. And we saw that happen in July. And it was in late May where this first came into alignment. And then all of a sudden, everything started just going a little bit haywire. And then it's going to be in play again during the elections. But I think that this is just something to keep in mind. And I think everybody knows this. I think that when we talk about things that are on the Aries point, it's the water that we're swimming in. And that's something that I really wanted to just bring forward is it's something that continually shows up and is going to continue to show up.
and then it's almost like putting on, as you go through these charts and look at the different combinations, it's almost like putting on different lenses and seeing it, same thing, from slightly different vantage points. And that shows up here, what we were just saying about Jupiter, Saturn, that kind of polarity. This shows up again here on the world axis, I think, with this Jupiter, Chronos, Hades. So now we're pitting the dream, the hopefulness, the optimism, the desire for change and growth up against the old guard and leadership, but in a way that shows them a little bit more things surfacing in terms of shadow material, in terms of us seeing some of the ugliness of of who we're looking at in terms of authority and leadership.
Hmm.
And in the midst of that, like you said, Lisa, there's this thing that the chart keeps speaking to moments of volatility and really heightened explosive dynamics. That this could be anything from simple like foot and mouth, like things literally just coming out, surfacing, or events like we saw with the assassination attempt.
Hmm.
And all of that too, this is a really interesting picture because this picture also pulls in Neptune. And so that's all happening in the context of a field that is not entirely clear.
Yeah, we have both Poseidon and Neptune strongly tied in here, which actually they are very connected just in general and with the Aries point for a while as well. So that's another kind of longer term water that we're all swimming in for quite some time is what do I believe? Like the slippery nature of truth. And we're all have this really deep desire for to know what the truth is. And a lot of this started Poseidon reached the Aries point in 2021. And we've been grappling with what's the truth and a whole bunch of different variations on that. And then Neptune started to really jump in there as well. And it's hard to know. We all have this deep desire to have a higher vision of what the world that we live in is. But at the same time, it's obscured every time we reach for it. And that's another huge important backdrop for where we are right now and where we're going to be until the around the middle of 2025.
I feel like there's some kind of potential in it for something really creative
Oh,
and
yeah,
new to emerge, you
definitely.
know? And truly, that high road Poseidon is us really leaning into higher levels of thinking and conceptualizing new spaces and using the
Mhm.
power of thought and our mind to dream the dream. It's just that
Yeah.
it's incredibly challenged right now in this chart,
Mhm.
particularly this month, because of everything else that's tying into that picture.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that you see that in so many different ways. I feel like for myself, and maybe it's just because I'm not involved politically, I don't see it necessarily always playing out on the political stage. I see it playing out in so many other areas of life for sure. This emergence of higher thought and spirituality and all of that, which is a totally different podcast conversation that we could have at some point. But yeah, I have to really put on my Pollyanna glasses. And I think one thing is you're right. And I think that part of the purpose, maybe from a overall vision of why is all of this happening right now, is that in order to really appreciate truth when we can hold it and when we can see it and when we have that clarity once Neptune subsides, it's like, and Uranus Volcanus is shaking things up also, challenging us to look for the truth, even though it's so fogged up, so obscured. So there is, I think, to your point, a deeper purpose behind the struggles that we're encountering right now.
And it's happening on so many levels.
So
And
many
we've been
levels.
talking a lot about the politics because it's an exciting year politically, and that's what's on the mind of the American public. But I just read an article in Harper's the other day called Exercising America, or what, like Exorcisms of America. And it's all about the movement of some of the Pentecostal, the church is rising up and hosting these huge events where they exorcise people, like cast out demons and stuff. And it has taken on this huge role. I didn't realize like how big this had become until reading this article. But now as I sit here and I look at this chart, I was like, oh my gosh, this so speaks to that
Yes.
the belief systems can be so potent and they can propel us into really crazy territory and
Yeah.
sense a lot of excitement and turbulence and the excavation of the shadow material and the
And
underworld and
yeah, and
facing.
what's on the other side of that veil?
Yeah.
I feel it's like through the use of psychedelics and breath work and what you're talking about, I feel like so many different groups of people who just a couple years ago we wouldn't have pictured stepping into this territory are really leaning into it. And it's really interesting. And I would love to do a deep dive on that at some point because
Mhm.
that's something that really excites me. But it's an important, I think, thing to understand about when we're talking about all of the other stuff is that this is also occurring.
And the fact that it's occurring across the board, it's like it's not occurring to a subset of people or people that
Mhm.
hold certain beliefs. We're all awash with it,
Mhm.
regardless of where we're coming from. And it's
Yeah.
just interesting to watch the little pockets of that show up in the news in different ways.
Oh my gosh, it's fascinating. It's been, yeah. Anyways, so let's continue on. We were just going to move this, stay on the Aries point real quick. I think there was one little thing we wanted to point out, which is Venus Pluto connected to the Aries point. We still have a lot of the same stuff getting pulled in, like the MC Sun Moon, which we didn't speak to before, but that's really just showing that the personal impact that these universal themes have on the United States this year or this month. But then the Venus Pluto ties into some of the themes that Sarah and I have been looking at, especially Sarah, you keep pointing them out, is how Venus seems to be really representing women and women stepping into a new place within the United States. And now we have a woman of color on the presidential ticket and at the top of it. And this is something that America, I think, is really grappling with and potentially pulling out some of the more mucky and dark material. And as well as potentially as that material is brought out, like hopefully bringing more power to women in a way that we haven't that we haven't seen before. And
Yeah, and at its most simplistic interpretation, it's fanaticism, right?
yeah,
That
definitely.
kind of ardent support that it's consuming.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Next, and this is when we move it to the MC, when we move the air to the MC, we could get really a similar sort of picture where, but instead of Venus, Pluto, now we have Venus, Apollon, which states that there's a woman who's reaching people far and wide, a woman who people are talking about women, people are having much more interesting and appealing and widespread conversations about women. And maybe it's specifically a woman, but I suspect that women are maybe even gaining more of a voice. I don't know if that's too optimistic.
No, I don't think so, because the Apollon brings expansion and this kind of spiraling out. And we've got that connected with the goddess, which is a really beautiful thing this month.
Mhm.
That to think that, yeah,
And I think that the Mars being so strongly involved almost adds this warrior element. Whatever's happening with this Venus Apollon is stepping into I in it is asserting itself. It's not stepping back. It's saying, "I am here, and I am here."
mhm,
And I think that's really notable for this perspective. Anything
yeah,
else you wanna throw in?
it's passionate.
Ooh,
It's passionate.
yeah.
Yeah, I think there's just so much that speaks to a deep level of feeling this
Mhm.
month too, in the context of the overall year. But yeah,
I like that. And then when we move to the sun moon, I'll let you speak to this.
oh gosh, this shows the flip side. This kind of shows us in the 12th house that what we're sitting in this way could create some inhibition or strain within our communities and our relationships and within our family systems. And that there's something happening around that's becoming sort of focused on that. That's a source of, I think that the way we're thinking, feeling, how we're holding all of this, our ideas and beliefs is becoming a source of focus within the community relationships in a way that is challenging.
Mhm. Yeah, almost further division amongst the cohesiveness and community that holds us together and something potentially dividing that even further. And one thing I just really came to my attention, which it didn't come to my attention so much before, is the Mercury and Metos being so strongly pulled into this as well. And that
Mhm.
there's some way where it's almost it's interesting that from this perspective, from the lunation itself, there's so much restriction. It feels like things are burdened, like the ways that our thoughts are being challenged, and a lot of people might be doubling down on the perspective that they had before, as so much is working to change and challenge and disrupt it. And sometimes that can be a natural way that the pendulum swings, is the more the that tradition and so forth, it needs to change in order to evolve. There's this reaction of to hold on tighter. And I can see this as holding on to ideas within our communities that is almost creating that separation more deeply because people a significant enough amount of people aren't willing to pivot. And there's a lot of pivoting that's being asked of us this month.
Yes. Yeah. Every time I see Saturn show up in a prominent way, I'm looking for myself, like, where is the work? I know it's a
Mhm.
little hard, but where is the work?
Mm,
And I wonder if the work in this case, in this month, is to go ahead and have the hard conversations
mm,
because maybe some of the Poseidon and some of the other influences this month could mitigate some of the harshness or open up some capacity for understanding.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think it's It could definitely tie in for sure. And there with Neptune there too, it can feel like a fogginess, but it can also be a compassion. And both Neptune and Poseidon are reminding us in so many different ways how connected we all are. And what's the responsibility in that? And which can be that Saturn to do. Like where's the responsibility and how we operate within our groups as there's so much change and turbulence that everybody is being impacted by. How do we hold our groups, how do we hold ourselves and our community steady and not have them separate, as I was speaking to before, which can be the flip side of that. How do we maintain our foundation and our solidity and remain steadfast, even though everything else is in upheaval?
It's going to take a little more work. I think that's what the chart says. It's just going to take a little more work this
It
month
is.
to soften into it, to keep the channels of communication open, to be sensitive to the relationship dynamics, and to try not to, like you said, it's a willingness to pivot or at least hear the other person's perspective,
Mhm.
to remind ourselves that we're in this together
Mhm.
and that we're all in a big collective experience right now this year in terms of being in it together and being very much affected by one another. And there's something that feels like the collective experience seems very heightened this year.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And for some reason, while you were speaking and just reflecting on Mercury Admetos in there is that Mercury stationing retrograde this month and
Oh,
is going to be retrograde the whole month.
yes.
And it seems like a good time to just almost be in the 12th house reflecting. And instead of being so reactive, there's going to be a lot of reaction going on for the next couple months. And instead of tiring ourselves out and creating damage in places that we might not really want to have damage, maybe just stepping back and taking the time to reflect and the time to go inwards. And yeah, I think that's in Mercury's signature, like its most prominent aspect that it's making during this retrograde cycle is it's square to Uranus. So that doesn't help things either, but because that's just saying that we're having a lot of really activated communication and news and ideas, and things are moving fast and furious, even if Mercury is retrograde. I don't know if that's gonna hold things back that much more. But remembering that we can, and remembering that's something that we always have the option of sitting and breathing
Mhm.
and finding the space within ourselves to remember who we are despite the chaos around us.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a beautiful way to be in the 12th house is to allow ourselves rest, retreat, and sanctuary. And also, I think to have some humility because
Yeah.
we are all in the soup. We are all prone to deception right now. We are all prone to the hypnosis. We are all prone to letting our personal ideology, our belief systems, our hopes and wishes color the way we're seeing the world. And just to hold it all lightly
Yeah.
and watch the show unfold because it's going to be, we're going to get hit with something this
We are
month.
in it, my friends.
Yeah.
It is here. I think on that, I think we covered a lot, and I hope that this time on this podcast episode has been helpful and hopefully given people some idea of what's potentially unfolding in this next month ahead of us from new moon to new moon. And Sarah and I just spent a lovely weekend together brainstorming and figuring out who and what broadcast astrology is. It was really lovely. And we're looking forward to being on this journey with all of you. And if you're here listening, thank you. If you feel so inclined to share or like our podcast, that would be great. And so, yeah, we'll keep you posted as new stuff comes up.
Thank you so much for joining us. And
Yeah.
thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Sarah.
See you again in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Lovely as always. Take care, everyone.